A flower shop's old account book hides more than debts, it hides motive. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Jack. Let's connect across time zones. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Reading your thoughts always brightens my day. Let's dive in. A ledger disappears. A florist dies. But the flowers, they speak louder than words. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Diego. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? Your messages bring this mystery to life. I truly love reading them. Now, let's begin. The late summer sun bathes the village of Little Winthorpe in a golden hue, catching on the panes of lace-curtained windows and turning the cobblestones of the high street to bronze. It was the kind of afternoon that made the world feel orderly, timeless until it wasn't. At the centre of this quaint, unsuspecting piece stood the ivy-clad shop front of Violet and Ivy, the village's beloved flower shop, where the scent of lilies and sweet peas mingled with old wood and beeswax. From the open door spilled the faint notes of a crackling wireless playing something cheerful, at odds with the tension that hovered inside. Mr. Godfrey Pritchard, the elderly florist and sole proprietor, was not a man known for dramatics. He was meticulous in nature, from the way he arranged gladioli to the tight-lipped reserve he maintained about his past. But that morning, several villagers had noticed the blinds drawn early and the closed sign turned with an unusual abruptness. That alone wouldn't have raised concern until Kitty Banfield, the vicar's daughter, stopped by for her mother's weekly bouquet and found the door unlocked, the till open, and Mr. Pritchard slumped behind the worktable, unmoving. By mid-afternoon, the whole of Little Winthorpe was abuzz. The word murder slipped out of Mrs. Mapleton's mouth with the scandalous reverence of a parish scandal. By the time Inspector Denham arrived from Milchester, there were at least 3 theories circulating and 5 villagers who swore they'd seen something odd the night before. At the edge of the village, sipping her tea with the serenity of someone accustomed to chaos cloaked in gentility, Miss Jane Marple listened without interruption as her nephew's wife, Dolly, breathlessly recounted the news. "It's unthinkable, Jane," Dolly said, her delicate hand trembling slightly as she reached for a biscuit. Godfrey was, well, he wasn't liked, precisely, but one never thought murdered, honestly. "What is the world coming to?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Not liked, you say? Oh, you know what I mean. Always so secretive, never joined the church fetes, and those endless arguments with young Lionel, you know, the delivery boy. I hear he was quite put out last week. Something about hours and pay. He stormed out in full view of the postmistress." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away behind her mild blue eyes. "And this ledger they keep whispering about, was there something missing?" "Apparently, yes, that big old floral accounts book of his. He kept every sale, every commission, even his private arrangements, I gather, vanished. Dolly Watson says the inspector looked in all the cupboards and drawers. Just gone. A curious thing for a thief to take," Miss Marple murmured. Dolly leaned in. Unless it wasn't a thief, unless someone had something to hide outside. The hum of village life faltered as a police motorcar pulled up to the shop. A small crowd had already gathered near Violet and Ivy. Speaking in hushed tones, Mrs. Hargrove, the grocer's wife, looked positively gleeful in her dismay. Mr. Lionel Brent, the sharp-nosed delivery boy with a habit of whistling too loudly, stood to one side, arms folded tightly across his chest. Miss Pritchard, the deceased spinster sister from Upham-on-Trent, had arrived barely 10 minutes ago and was now pacing in front of the constable, demanding to see the will. It was heart trouble, insisted the butcher's apprentice. My uncle had the same look when he keeled over on Christmas Eve. It was poison, argued Mrs. Gubbins. Mark my words. That florist tea he always drank had a queer smell, but the drawer was empty, muttered Lionel, too softly for most to hear. He never left it unlocked, never, inside the shop. Inspector Denham surveyed the scene with growing unease. Godfrey Pritchard lay half-sprawled against a shelf of dried roses, a half-written invoice curling under his lifeless hand. No immediate signs of violence, no broken glass. The cash register was untouched. But the missing ledger and the faint scent of something bitter on the florist's teacup hinted at an unseen disturbance. Miss Marple, ever courteous, declined a ride with Dolly and instead strolled alone toward the centre of the village. She has not visited the flower shop, not yet. She stopped, instead, by the library, where Mrs. Longford, the sharp-eyed librarian, was returning from her midday break. I always found Mr. Pritchard quite fond of certain rare volumes, Miss Marple said lightly, watching the woman's expression. Did he not once inquire after the language of flowers? Mrs. Longford adjusted her spectacles. That he did. 3 times, no less. I dare say he fancied himself a secret keeper. That book's full of meanings, bluebells for humility, marigolds for grief, lavender for suspicion, or remembrance, Miss Marple said softly. Mrs. Longford hesitated, then added, he reserved it last month, but he never collected it. And with that, Miss Marple knew 2 things. 1, that someone had cause to remember something best forgotten, and 2, that in a village like Little Winthorpe, flowers often said more than people dared. She will visit the flower shop tomorrow. But tonight, she would reread her own copy of the language of flowers and consider what sort of message a missing ledger might be trying to conceal. By the following morning, the village of Little Winthorpe had transformed into a well-manicured garden of rumours. Conversation sprouted on doorsteps, flourished under hedgerows, and bloomed full force at the bakery counter, where Mrs. Forsyth, flower-dusted and bright-eyed, recounted her version of events for the 5th time that hour. Well, I said to Martin, if he was murdered, it will have had to be someone he knew. No signs of forced entry, was there, and that poor girl Kitty found him slumped like a bouquet gone limp. Miss Marple, who had arrived just in time for her usual currant scone, listened patiently from her quiet corner near the window. She sat with her gloves still folded beside her teacup and a small embroidered handbag perched on the chair next to her, as though even her accessories waited with decorum. Of course, Mrs. Forsyth went on, lowering her voice theatrically. Everyone's saying it's the Brent boy, Lionel, storming out of the shop not a week ago in full temper, slammed the door hard enough to jangle the flower pots. Didn't I see him lurking by the hedge near the post office just last night? Miss Marple looked up mildly. What time last night, if I may ask? Oh, 7:30, I'd say. Just after the bell from St. Mildred's rang out. I was feeding the cat, you know, so I heard it quite distinctly. Miss Marple nodded, seemingly more interested in the precision of the church bell than in the accusation itself. Across the room, the conversation shifted as Mrs. Pritchard, the deceased sister, entered the bakery, her tightly buttoned coat and bristling manner casting a sudden hush. She glanced around with sharp eyes that had clearly done little crying. I'll take a wholemeal loaf, she said crisply, then after a pause, and if there's a seat available. Miss Marple smiled warmly and gestured to the chair across from her. You must be weary, she said gently, and rather overwhelmed. I'm Jane Marple. I knew your brother only a little, but I'm terribly sorry for your loss. Miss Pritchard gave a tight nod and sat. I'm not weeping in public, if that's what anyone expects. Godfrey and I weren't particularly close, but he was family, and now I suppose it falls to me to sort through his affairs. A difficult task, Miss Marple said softly, especially with a household so full of flowers. One always imagines something fresh and joyful about floristry, but grief can lie beneath the petals. Can't it? Mrs. Pritchard gave her a long look. Grief and secrets. Godfrey was, private. He kept his ledgers locked and spoke little of the past. I dare say he had arrangements I never knew about. You mean floral arrangements? Miss Marple asked. Her tone light. Mrs. Pritchard didn't smile. I mean personal ones. He was always busy with little deliveries, weddings, memorials, sympathy posies to women no one remembered had died. And then there was the ledger. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Everyone's mentioned it. Vanished, I believe. Indeed, the police seemed most interested in it, but Godfrey was careful. Perhaps too careful. There were whispers once about his time in London before he came back to the village. Some say it involved a scandal, but he never spoke of it, not even to me. The conversation was interrupted by the chime of the bakery door. Lionel Brent strode in, his expression tightened. Defensive. He ordered to jam donuts, barely glanced at the women near the window, and turned to leave when Mrs. Pritchard's voice cut through the room like a paper knife. Thought you'd have the decency to offer condolences, she said, loud enough for every ear in the room to catch. Lionel turned slowly, cheeks colouring. I was going to, he muttered, but I figured you'd accuse me of something if I did. You did threaten my brother, she said. Miss Marple intervened gently. Young tempers run hot, Miss Pritchard, but that hardly makes a murderer, does it? Perhaps Lionel could help us understand a few things, if you're willing. Of course, Lionel hesitated, then looked at Miss Marple. There was something about her voice soft, bird-like, but oddly commanding. He sat down stiffly at the next table, keeping his donuts between them like a barrier. I didn't kill Mr. Pritchard, he said. Bluntly, we argued, sure, but it wasn't like that. Tell us what it was like, Miss Marple prompted. Lionel leaned back. He was cutting my R's. Said business was fragile lately, but I knew he was still doing special jobs, late deliveries, custom arrangements for people he never named. He kept them all in that stupid ledger. Wouldn't let me near it. And when was the last time you saw him? Miss Marple asked. 2 days ago. I dropped off a shipment of freesia. He barely looked at me, just nodded and locked himself in the back. Said he had something to prepare for the solicitor. That caught Miss Pritchard's attention. Solicitor? What would Godfrey need him for? I figured it was a will, Lionel said. He had a sealed envelope and everything. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed faintly behind her spectacles. A will, you say? How very interesting. Back at her cottage that afternoon. Miss Marple brewed a fresh pot of tea and laid out 3 things on her kitchen table. A small, leather-bound copy of The Language of Flowers, a map of Little Winthorpe, and a page torn from her gardening journal. On it, she began to sketch a timeline not of the murder, but of the deliveries. Godfrey's life, she suspected, had been mapped not in milestones but in bouquets. If she could trace the pattern of flowers he'd sent, who received what and when, perhaps she could trace the motive behind his death. That evening, while the village debated theories in parlours and at the pub, Miss Marple did something unexpected. She visited the cemetery. The light had faded to that soft blue between day and dusk, and the headstones stood like weary watchers in rows. She moved slowly among them until she found what she was looking for, a modest granite stone with faded etching. Evelyn M. Cartwright, 1892 to 1935, forever beloved. Always missed. Someone had left a single white carnation at its base. Miss Marple bent and brushed a leaf from the grave. Carnations, she whispered. For remembrance, but not from a family member. Evelyn had no family left. She rose, her fingers still curled around the stem of the carnation. If someone had remembered Evelyn Cartwright after all these years, it wasn't out of sentiment, it was out of guilt or fear, and that, Miss Marple thought, might be where the story truly began. The next morning, Little Winthorpe awoke to find itself more tightly wound in the tendrils of mystery than ever before. The village, ordinarily so rhythmically predictable, post at 9, milk by 10, Gossip by 11 now pulsed with a different beat. There was something in the air, an ease, yes, but also a reluctant excitement. After all, a murder if one dared to call it that had not graced their hedgerows since the days of horse-drawn traps and gaslight, at Violet and Ivy. The constables had cordoned off the entrance with little ceremony and a great deal of tape. A padlock now hung where once flower wreaths had adorned the door. The scent of lavender and hyacinth still clung faintly to the air, but beneath it, something sharper lingered: loss, suspicion, and the faint sting of betrayal. Inspector Denham stood just inside the shop, examining the empty slot on the shelf where the ledger had been kept. It was confirmed now Godfrey's master record book had not simply been misplaced, it had been taken, quietly, deliberately, and with knowledge of exactly where it was kept. Only two people ever touched that book, he muttered, half to himself. Godfrey and someone who wanted it very badly. He turned to Constable Partridge, who was peering suspiciously at the arrangement table as though it might confess. "What about the will?" Denham asked. "Any sign of that envelope the boy mentioned?" "None, sir," Partridge replied. "We searched the flat upstairs top to bottom. Nothing sealed, nothing recent. Just an old will dated 1939, leaves everything to the sister." Denham frowned. "That doesn't fit. The boy said it looked freshly sealed. He might have mistaken it for something else," Partridge offered, "or exaggerated, or someone else found it first." That same hour, Miss Marple took her walk along Old Lime Tree Lane, a narrow, winding path that led past the vicarage, the orchard, and finally, toward the modest cottage of Mrs. Clarice Hargrove. Known by all as a fountain of half-truths and full-volume opinions, Mrs. Hargrove was nevertheless useful when one desired to know what people were whispering behind their hands. Miss Marple found her on the front steps, shelling peas into a chipped bowl and humming a hymn with faintly off-key determination. "Oh, Miss Marple," she chirped, brushing her apron. "Just saying to myself how strange it all is, so much excitement." "For 1 week, I thought I might stretch my legs a little," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "All this talk has left me with a mind full of tangled thoughts." Mrs. Hargrove beamed. "You and me both." "Why, just yesterday, my cousin said she saw Mr. Pritchard speaks rather sharply with that fancy widow from Fern Hollow, Mrs. Elspeth Lorne. You know, the one always swanning about in that fox stole." "Acting like she's above the WI, Elspeth Lorne?" Miss Marple asked, surprised. "I didn't know she was a client." "Oh, more than that, I'd wager. He used to visit her cottage late in the evenings, always carrying one of those long white Florist boxes. My niece says she saw him there last Thursday, and the lights didn't go out till nearly midnight." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already placing Mrs. Lorne along the invisible map she'd been constructing. The flamboyant widow with an air of tragedy. What reason would she have to need floral arrangements at such odd hours? A romantic entanglement? A secret message? Funny thing, though, Mrs. Hargrove continued, lowering her voice, "I heard she came into some trouble a few years ago in Surrey. A gentleman friend, something about his estate. She's not poor, mind you, but I hear she's not as comfortable as she pretends. Isn't that often the way?" Miss Marple murmured. After a polite farewell, and a paper cone of sugared plums pressed into her hand for the road, Miss Marple continued her walk toward Fern Hollow. It was an elegant, ivy-draped bungalow on the edge of the woods. Slightly too grand for the village, and noticeably out of place among the thatched roofs and modest rose gar dens. Mrs. Lorne answered the door herself, dressed in a wine-coloured dressing gown and slippers with fur trim. "Miss Marple," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Forgive the intrusion, Mrs. Lorne," Miss Marple said gently, "but I was hoping to speak with you." "About Mr. Pritchard?" For a moment, something flickered in the widow's gaze. Then it was gone. Awful, isn't it? She said with a practiced sigh. Godfrey was so talented. I'm still reeling. I understand he delivered flowers to you quite regularly, Miss Marple said. Rather thoughtful, considering. Mrs. Lorne blinked. Oh, that, yes he did. I commissioned some displays for my late husband's Memorial Day. Purely sentimental, of course. But I heard he came rather late in the evenings? The widow's smile stiffened. He preferred discretion. We shared an understanding that the village might misinterpret frequent visits. Miss Marple inclined her head. It's a curious thing, Mrs. Lorne. You see, it appears Mr. Pritchard may have altered his will recently and possibly kept a record of certain arrangements, financial or otherwise, in a ledger now gone missing. Mrs. Lorne's lips pressed into a line. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with either, you're mistaken. I suggest nothing, dear, Miss Marple replied kindly. Only that grief past or present sometimes binds people in unexpected ways. She left soon after, allowing the silence that followed her to weigh down the elegant sitting room like falling petals. That evening, Inspector Denham himself appeared. At Miss Marple's cottage, hat in hand, they sat in the parlour, a pot of tea between them, the sun casting amber streaks across the crocheted antimacassars. I've heard you've been busy, Denham said with a tired smile. Only listening, Miss Marple replied. Though it seems what one hears can often be more useful than what one sees. Denham leaned forward. What's your sense of it? That Mr. Pritchard had secrets, she said simply. And that someone was afraid he intended to reveal them, or worse, memorialize them in the will, in the ledger, Miss Marple corrected. He was a florist, inspector, a man who spoke in flowers. Each delivery, each bouquet, each bloom it meant something. Perhaps not to the police, but certainly to those involved. I believe he was writing a sort of confessional. One only he could read, but others knew existed. Denham frowned. And now it's vanished, and someone went to great lengths to make sure it stayed that way, as the sky deepened to violet. Miss Marple gazed out the window at her garden, where the dahlias were just beginning to bloom. There was something comforting about flowers as they opened gradually, revealing layer upon layer, each petal leading closer to the heart. Much like secrets, and she was certain little Winthorpe had not yet revealed its innermost bloom. On Thursday morning, the village awoke to drizzle and doubt. The sky hung low and silver like an old pewter teapot, and the mist seemed to cling to the hedgerows as though it, too, were eavesdropping. The murder or unexplained death, as the more cautious still called it, had stirred something deeper in little Winthorpe than mere scandal. There was a tremor in the routines, a hesitance in every nod and greeting, as if people had begun to look inward and wonder what secrets their neighbours kept or remembered of them. Miss Marple found herself drawn, as she often was in matters of confusion, to the churchyard. It had been 2 days since her quiet visit to Evelyn Cartwright's grave. And something about that single carnation, left anonymously in remembrance, had gnawed at her quietly. Ever since the vicar, Reverend Lennox, a tall man with a perpetually fobbed-up expression and the voice of a kindly clock, greeted her beneath the archway as he closed the chapel doors. "Miss Marple," he said, brushing raindrops from his coat, out for another thoughtful wander. "Always," she replied warmly. "I find a walk among the dead can often teach one more about the living." The Reverend chuckled softly, though his eyes were pained. "You refer to Mr. Pritchard, no doubt. I still can't quite believe it. He was difficult, yes, but orderly, as if even death would have had to make an appointment. Orderly people often keep the messiest truths, I find," said Miss Marple. "Tell me, Reverend, did Mr. Pritchard ever speak to you in confidence about Evelyn Cartwright?" The question startled him. "Evelyn, my word, that's years ago, a sad business, unwed, left with nothing after her brother died. She worked at the old registry office in Milchester." I believe. But no, Godfrey never spoke of her to me. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the row of stones beyond. I found a carnation on her grave, recently placed. That is odd, Lennox murmured. No one visits that plot any more. She had no family. It was Mr. Pritchard who paid for the headstone, you know, quietly, anonymously, or so he believed. Miss Marple's head tilted. How curious. Did you know that a white carnation can mean remembrance, but also, in certain circles, regret? The Reverend blinked. I'd always thought it meant purity. Only to the untrained eye, Miss Marple said gently. Later that day, Inspector Denham arrived at the vicarage to inquire about a different matter entirely. The Pritchard residence above the shop had yielded something of mild interest, a crumpled paper hidden at the bottom of a flour waste bin, partially burned. It appeared to be a page torn from the ledger. Only 3 lines were legible on the 6th of August. To white lilies, 1 marigold, EC the 13th of August, pink carnation, no card, LH the 20th of August, order held. Confirmed by, and then nothing. The final line had been scorched beyond recognition. I'm not a botanist, Denham said, spreading the brittle page across the table between them. But there's something coded about this, isn't there, Miss Marple? Took her time, tracing each entry as if it were a confession whispered under breath. Lilies and marigolds, she murmured, grief and mourning, paired with sorrow or pain. And initials E.C. Evelyn Cartwright. I dare say the date matches the week. I visited her grave. Someone still thought of her. Someone with something to say they couldn't utter aloud. And the next, Denham pointed, pink carnations. LH Miss Marple's lips pursed. Pink carnations can mean gratitude, or sometimes refuse. LH could be Lionel Brent, if we use H as a middle initial or someone else entirely. But the key, Inspector, is that these are not just orders, they're messages, silent correspondences. Denham rubbed his temple. And the last one? Order held. Confirmed by someone tried to burn that entry. Because it mattered, said Miss Marple, because whoever confirmed it knew what it meant and feared others might guess, that afternoon. Lionel Brent stood outside the post office, smoking a cigarette, and trying not to appear as though he were loitering. Miss Marple approached him with gentle purpose. I've been thinking of your deliveries, Lionel, she said, smiling softly. I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. Did Mr. Pritchard ever ask you to deliver flowers to unusual places? Lionel looked wary. He kept a few clients private. If that's what you mean, private, she echoed, like, not in the books I saw. He'd wrap them himself and hand them to me with a tip. Tell me which address. Never put it through the till. Said it was personal business. And do you remember any of those deliveries? Lionel hesitated. I remember one, late July. He gave me a box blue ribbon. That's how I knew it wasn't standard. Said take it to Fern Hollow, to Mrs. Lorne. I asked what the occasion was. He looked at me like I'd said something rude. Did you see what was inside? A single rose, yellow, with a sprig of heather. And no card. Miss Marple gave a small hum. A yellow rose for friendship or jealousy, heather for admiration or solitude. Lionel blinked. You make it sound like code. I think it was, she said, and you were the unwitting messenger, later, as twilight brushed the village in lavender tones. Miss Marple returned home with her mind full of petals and half-truths. She opened her worn copy of the Language of Flowers once more, turning to the annotated pages she'd marked decades ago. Flowers, she thought, could say anything. They could whisper regrets and scream accusations. They could revive the memory of a long-lost love or bury a betrayal under layers of bloom. And someone in Little Winthorpe had used them to speak of a secret one Godfrey Pritchard intended to preserve in ink, only for it to be erased in fire. But flames, Miss Marple knew, only destroyed the page. The message always lingered in the scent, and she was beginning to smell guilt in full blossom. By Friday morning, the rain had lifted, but the village of Little Winthorpe remained clouded with unease. The air carried the freshness of damp earth and disturbed roots appropriate, Miss Marple thought, for a place where so many truths seemed buried beneath polite smiles and garden borders. The talk at the grocer's had shifted from speculation about Lionel Brent's temper to mutterings about Mrs. Elspeth Lorne's past. Some said she had once been married to a diplomat. Others claimed she had been ruined in London by a scandal too dreadful to name, only to reinvent herself in this sleepy village with an expensive wardrobe and no husband in sight. As Miss Marple walked through the high street that morning, she passed the shuttered doors of violet and ivy and paused, as she always did, to study its quiet facade. There was something mournful about the way the hanging basket by the entrance had wilted, neglected. The scent of violets and rosemary had long since faded. She lingered for a moment, almost expecting something to stir inside, some flicker behind the frosted glass. Some faint rustle of petals, but there was only silence. It was not the shop she intended to visit, but the back garden. Miss Marple had noticed, on a previous walk, that the lane behind the shop led to a small enclosed yard, partially hidden by ivy and a crumbling brick wall. She had also noticed that the constables, more focused on the ledger and the flat upstairs, had paid it little attention. She found the gate unlocked and cracked it open slowly. The garden was small and neat, the kind of space only a florist could have kept. Rows of well-tended planters, a compost heap in one corner, and a series of wooden boxes marked with flower types. Marigolds, lilies, forget-me-nots, but what caught her attention was a narrow patch of disturbed earth near the base of the shed. The soil there had been recently turned, and not for planting. There were no seeds, no seedlings, only a rough, uneven trench hastily filled and poorly raked. She bent down and studied it more closely. The ground was damp but not muddy. The scent of compost mingled with something sharper. She brushed her gloved fingers across the soil and, after a moment, uncovered the corner of a small, pale envelope. Its edge stained dark. She lifted it gently. The envelope was unsealed, empty, and bore no address, but it had once contained something important, perhaps, maybe even a will. She turned it over. There, faint but unmistakable, was the embossed mark of Mr. Havisham, the village solicitor. Her heart gave a tiny leap. If someone had destroyed a recent will and left behind only the envelope, she stood and looked around the yard again. Something else caught her eye, a thin trail of white petals leading from the shed door to the far corner of the garden, where a small stone bench rested beneath a hawthorn tree. The petals were crushed, broken in places, as though someone had walked across them in haste. Miss Marple followed them to the bench and sat down. The garden was still, save for the sound of a single bee buzzing near the rosemary bush. It was peaceful, but it had seen something violent, something hidden. Someone had come here in the dark, someone who had known about the will and the ledger, and someone who had thought to bury the evidence. Later that day, at the tea room near the square, Miss Marple met Inspector Denham for a quiet cup. "I found something this morning," she said without preamble, sliding the envelope across the table. Denham raised his eyebrows and examined it. "From Havisham, it appears so, and it was buried behind the shop beneath a fresh patch of soil." He frowned. "No document inside, none. But I believe it once held the revised will we've heard so much about." Denham exhaled slowly. "So someone destroyed the new will, hoping the old one would stand, and perhaps also destroyed the ledger," Miss Marple added, "to documents both inconvenient, both removed." The inspector leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "You believe the motive is inheritance, then?" "Not solely," said Miss Marple. "Mr. Pritchard was not a wealthy man. His estate is modest. But what he left behind, his records, his floral messages, contained something far more dangerous than money. Denham nodded. Secrets, exactly, and secrets, Inspector, are currency in places like Little Winthorpe. That afternoon, a new name entered Miss Marple's mind, one she had not yet placed in her map of connections: Harold Fitch. Mr. Fitch ran the printing press at the edge of the village and was known primarily for two things: his bushy eyebrows and his discretion. He had once printed wedding invitations for half the county and, more recently, the order of service for Godfrey Pritchard's last funeral arrangement. A memorial bouquet sent to a woman named Constance Gray, who had died in 1978, Miss Marple, paid him a visit just before closing time. His workshop smelled of ink and warm paper, and his apron bore the dark smudges of a man who had long since given up trying to stay clean. "Miss Marple," he said, blinking in surprise. "Well, now, you're not planning a wedding, I hope." "Not unless one plans to marry off the past," she replied with a twinkle. "I was hoping you could help me with a small curiosity. Did Mr. Pritchard ever request printing services not related to flowers?" Fitch scratched his head. "Now and then, little cards, discreet messages, no return address. Once I even asked myself to print an obituary that was never published. Come to think of it, do you remember the name? Evelyn M. Cartwright." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Did he explain?" "Not at all, just said it was personal, paid in cash, left with the proof, never came back further. Final copies. And the card messages were floral in theme. Oh yes, all sorts, for the love we couldn't name. I remember, to the one who waited, strange stuff, beautifully sad, though." Miss Marple left the print shop with the sense of a picture slowly emerging through the fog. Godfrey had been preparing something, not just a will but a reckoning, that evening. As she sat in her sitting room with her knitting resting forgotten in her lap, she reviewed her notes once again. 3 names now stood out: Evelyn Cartwright, Elspeth Lorne, and Constance Gray. 3 women, 3 ghosts, and Godfrey Pritchard at the centre of their stories. The question now was not just who had killed him, it was what truth he had been ready to release and who had been desperate enough to silence him first. By Saturday morning, the mist had lifted from the hedgerows, but not from the hearts of Little Winthorpe's villagers. A strange hush had fallen over the high street. The bell from St. Mildred struck 8 and rang out against a sky the colour of parchment, but it sounded more like a question than a summons. Miss Marple, already awake and dressed in a warm dove-grey cardigan and her best straw hat, stood at the window with her cup of tea cooling beside her. Her knitting was untouched on the arm of the chair, and a small notepad lay open in her lap, covered in pencil-drawn flowers, each labelled with a name and a date: Evelyn M. Cartwright, Constance Gray, Elspeth Lorne, and now, from Harold Fitch's printing shop, another name had emerged: Thomas Ainsley. Mr. Ainsley had been the village schoolmaster many years ago, a quiet bachelor with a passion for poetry and an odd fondness for foxgloves. He had died in 1979, nearly a year after Constance Gray, whose obituary Godfrey had never published. The connection between them remained obscure. But Miss Marple's instincts had begun to stir in that subtle, unmistakable way, like a faint draught. Beneath a closed door, she knew what came next: visits, questions, and a little gentle nudging where needed. The sort of nudging one only trusted to an old woman with clear eyes and a lace handkerchief, always at the ready. By 9:30, she was seated in the sitting room of Havisham & Co., the village solicitor's modest office tucked between the bank and the milliners. The reception smelled of old paper and lemon polish, and the young clerk at the front desk looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. But Mr. Havisham himself, a balding man with the kind of spectacles that made him look both startled and stern, greeted Miss Marple with a warmth born of mutual respect and perhaps A hint of caution, Miss Marple, he said, gesturing toward a high-backed chair. How may I help? I'll be direct, she said with a smile. I believe Mr. Pritchard may have recently updated his will. I also believe it never reached your desk. Mr. Havisham's expression did not change, but his fingers moved slightly across the folder on his desk. I am bound by confidentiality, of course, quite so, she said, but a will that was never signed, never delivered. Well, I suppose that makes it more of a draft than a document. He studied her. He did write to me. He admitted at last, requested an appointment. Said he had something delicate to finalize. That was last Thursday, I replied. At once, he never answered. He died the following Monday, Miss Marple said gently. Mr. Havisham nodded. I assumed he changed his mind. It happens with older men. Doubts creep in. Do you recall the nature of the changes? Havisham hesitated. He said he wished to remove his sister as sole beneficiary. Miss Marple gave a slow nod, and instead, he mentioned 3 names. Miss Evelyn Cartwright died, Miss Constance Gray also died, and a Mrs. Elspeth Lorne, to whom he intended to leave the shop and residence. In memory and atonement, he wrote. Striking phrasing, he seemed burdened, as if the will were a confession. Thank you, Miss Marple said. That's quite helpful. When she stepped back into the sunlight, the breeze stirred the hem of her skirt and carried with it the scent of cut grass and distant roses. She paused for a moment on the pavement, drawing the pieces of the puzzle closer together in her mind. The dead had been named, but why? She crossed the street and made her way toward Elspeth Lorne's house at Fern Hollow. This time, when the widow answered the door, there was a flicker of something unguarded in her eyes. She had removed her makeup, and her dressing gown had been replaced with a modest skirt and blouse, as if she were bracing herself for something solemn. I wondered when you'd return, she said quietly, holding the door open. They sat in the conservatory, where ferns curled against the glass and the light was softened by green shadows. Miss Marple took her tea with no sugar and watched the other woman with gentle intent. Mrs. Lorne, she said, I must ask plainly now, what was your connection to Godfrey Pritchard? Elspeth's hands trembled just slightly as she lifted her cup. He loved someone once, she said finally. Someone he wasn't allowed to love. Evelyn Cartwright. Miss Marple inclined her head, because she was of lower status, because she was pregnant. Elspeth replied flatly, and unmarried, and he failed her. Miss Marple was silent. She left the village for Milchester, had the child in secret. Godfrey sent money, but he never claimed the child. Not publicly. Evelyn died young. The girl Rosalind was raised by friends. No one ever knew. Rosalind, Miss Marple echoed softly. She died in her 20s. Consumption, I believe, and Constance Gray, Evelyn's closest friend, never forgave Godfrey. Nor did I was his cousin, you see, and I knew you were protecting someone's legacy. I was protecting what was left of her dignity. Miss Marple's voice dropped, but Godfrey changed. In his way, he began recording everything in his ledger, messages, orders, flowers coded in gilt. In remembrance, he was trying to put things right. Elspeth nodded slowly. He meant to leave the shop to me to restore it, perhaps, in Rosalind's memory. He said he would deliver the revised will last Sunday, but he never arrived. Miss Marple rose. I believe he was intercepted. Outside, the sky had dimmed again. A storm, perhaps, on the horizon. But the true storm was still gathering. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple added one last name to her notepad. Rosalind C. And then, beneath it, a question. Who else knew? The circle was tightening. 3 women, 1 child. And a shopkeeper tried to write his apology in flowers, but someone had found out too soon. And they had silenced the apology before it could ever be heard. By Sunday morning, the church bells of St. Mildred's rang with a note too bright for the moon that lingered over Little Winthorpe. Parishioners filed in with bowed heads and awkward glances, the kind reserved for funerals and local scandals. The pews were dotted with uneasy bodies dressed in best coats and subdued hats, but the usual murmurs and greetings were strained, even the hymns lacked conviction. Their verses floating without force against the stained glass windows. Miss Marple sat in her usual place near the front, the hymnal resting unopened in her lap. She was not here for a sermon or song this morning. Her thoughts wandered far from the pulpit. Somewhere in this congregation, or watching from beyond its walls, was the person who had silenced Godfrey Pritchard. She did not believe the motive was money. The legacy he had sought to leave behind was not measured in pounds or property, but in penance, a man of few words. Godfrey had turned to the silent language of flowers to speak what he could not. That someone had feared his truth enough to erase it said more than any sermon could. After the service, she waited at the light gate, greeting those who passed by. Her gaze settled on Lionel Brent as he emerged with his head low and his shoulders hunched. He looked pale and uneasy, the way one does when too many eyes have weighed them unfairly. She approached him gently. "Lionel," she said, "may I trouble you for a short walk?" He nodded wordlessly. They strolled past the green, down toward the stream, where the reeds bowed in the breeze. "You've felt watched, haven't you?" Miss Marple asked quietly. He didn't answer at first. "I didn't kill him," he said at last, "even if everyone thinks I might have. I didn't even know about any will. I was angry, yes, but not like that. I believe you," she said simply. He blinked. "You do?" "I do, but tell me." "Lionel, was there anyone else you saw near the shop that Sunday? Anyone who shouldn't have been?" He hesitated. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Trouble has already found us, I'm afraid." He kicked at a stone. "Mrs. Pritchard, the sister, I saw her going around sunset. Thought it was strange. The shop was supposed to be closed." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed faintly. "You're certain?" She had her handbag, the big brown one. She looked, determined, back at her cottage. Miss Marple opened her notes again. She traced the line of events. Slowly, like the stitching of a hem being unpicked, Godfrey requests a new will. Names the women Evelyn, Constance, Elspeth as symbols of an unspoken past, scheduled delivery for Sunday, and then vanishes from his own intentions, the missing will. The burned page from the ledger, the crushed white petals leading away from the shed, and now a sighting of his sister in the hours before the shop was sealed. Miss Marple recalled her first encounter with Miss Pritchard at the bakery. The clipped tone, the lack of tears. The outrage, not grief, the insistence that Lionel was guilty, the curious way she had asked about seeing the will before anyone had confirmed its existence. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Pritchard family home on the edge of the village, a neat semi-detached cottage with geraniums in the windows and lace curtains drawn too tightly. Miss Pritchard opened the door in her usual no-nonsense manner. "I was just sitting down to tea," she said stiffly. "How fortunate," Miss Marple replied with a smile. "I won't take more than a moment." They sat in the parlour, where everything was buttoned and beige. The room smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and something metallic beneath. "You must be terribly burdened," Miss Marple said gently. "So much responsibility, settling your brother's affairs." Miss Pritchard gave a tight nod. "It's unpleasant business, but I'll see it through." Godfrey left everything to me, as expected. Even after all these years of separation, her eyes flicked. "He may have been distant, but blood is blood, unless," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanging. "He intended to change that." A silence settled. Heavy, tense, Miss Marple reached into her bag and removed the scorched envelope. "I found this behind the shop." Miss Pritchard's fingers twitched. "It means nothing." "I think it meant everything," said Miss Marple. "I think your brother's conscience had finally grown louder than his pride. I think he wanted to set things right. Something to do with Evelyn Cartwright and her child." The woman across from her paled. "You knew," Miss Marple said quietly. "You knew he had planned to alter the will. You followed him into the garden. Perhaps you argued, perhaps you begged, and when he refused, you panicked." "That's absurd. I found soil under your fingernails at the bakery, fresh soil, and I noticed the scrape on your left hand. Gardening injury, you claimed. But you don't garden, do you?" "Not since the arthritis." Miss Pritchard rose, her face tight and pale. "You've no proof." "No," Miss Marple said, standing as well. "But guilt has a way of growing through cracks. It sends out shoots. Soon, everyone notices." As she turned to leave, Miss Marple looked once more at the prim sofa, the untouched tea tray, the tightly wound curtains. "If it comforts you," she added, "I believe your brother forgave you. He didn't report the will sooner. He left time for reflection. But I think he also knew you might never let go of the past." Outside, the wind picked up through the hedgerows. The petals on the path trembled, and Miss Marple walked away knowing the garden was nearly ready to bloom with truth. The early evening light fell softly across Little Winthorpe, casting long shadows over the cobbled pavements and flickering through curtains drawn half-closed in anticipation of Sunday supper. Yet behind those curtains, few households were at rest. Either whispering had returned low, insistent, and full of glances toward the Pritchard cottage and the flower shop that still stood shuttered like a stage awaiting its final act. Miss Marple, however, was not yet ready for the final curtain. Back at her cottage, she laid out the last pages of her garden diary beside the annotated names and flower meanings that had slowly emerged. Over the course of the past week, each name told a fragment of the story, each flower a shade of regret, secrecy, or love unspoken. And now something else has surfaced, not a person, not even a clue exactly, but a pattern. A distinct arrangement of times and dates that had begun to form something more than coincidental, something deliberate. Miss Marple had long believed that human nature repeated itself, shaped like the seasons, moved by the same invisible hands. If one knew where to look, one could anticipate the bloom of deceit just as easily as the flowering of primroses in March. She sipped her tea slowly and turned her attention to the notes from Inspector Denham, who had paid her a brief but meaningful visit earlier in the day. There had been no arrest, yet nothing firm enough to justify it, despite Miss Marple's quiet suggestion regarding Miss Pritchard. The inspector, though respectful, had asked for time, proof. He'd said, not poetry, but Miss Marple did not deal in poetry. She dealt with people, and something told her there was still a voice left unheard in this tale. She tucked her notebook into her handbag and set off once again, walking through the hush of the village until she reached the edge of West Garden Lane. There, behind a low brick wall covered in moss, stood a modest cottage with daffodils beginning to tilt toward dusk. This was the home of Mrs. Ivy Green, a name unremarkable to most, but to Miss Marple, recently jotted in the margin of the burned page from the ledger. A flower recipient, her initials scribbled faintly beside a cryptic phrase, April 2nd, single violet, with card, Mrs. Green had worked for the Pritchards long ago. A housemaid turned companion during their parents' final years. Since then, she had remained in Little Winthorpe, keeping to herself, speaking rarely. But Miss Marple remembered her for her sharp mind and sharper eyes, the kind that noticed things others did not. She knocked gently. The door creaked open, and Ivy Green, now in her 70s with a stooped back and a wool shawl pinned carefully, peered out. Miss Marple, she said with surprise, "My goodness, come in, I've just put the kettle on." They sat in the small kitchen with its stone floor and geraniums blooming definitely on the windowsill. The air smelled of sage and sugar biscuits. "Ivy," Miss Marple said softly. "I wonder if you recall a flower delivery Mr. Pritchard made to you earlier this month. A violet, I believe." Mrs. Green stilled for just a moment, then nodded. "I do. It arrived on the 2nd. No sender. Just the violet, and a card that said, 'Thank you for not telling them.' Curious wording. Very. You knew about Evelyn Cartwright, didn't you?" A long pause. "I suspected," Ivy said at last. "I never knew the whole of it, but I saw things, notes, a locket. Godfrey used to visit a small flat in Milchester, always. Late, brought flowers he never put on the books. I cleaned up after him when he returned muddy shoes, petals stuck to his coat, that sort of thing. And you never told his sister. I tried once. She dismissed it, said I was reading too many novels, that he had unfortunate acquaintances in the city, but it was none of my business. After that I kept quiet, but I remembered, and he remembered your silence." Mrs. Green smiled sadly. "He did. But it wasn't guilt that killed him, was it?" "No," Miss Marple said. "It was someone else's fear." As she left the cottage, the last rays of sunlight cut across the footpath, and Miss Marple paused beneath the old sycamore near the green. She thought again of the missing ledger, the burned entry, the envelope in the soil. She imagined Godfrey's quiet hands placing each flower, each coded message, knowing that his reckoning was close. But not everyone had wanted the past unearthed. She turned toward the square, where lights had begun to glow behind the windows of the tea room, and there, through the glass, she saw Miss Pritchard again alone at a corner table, staring into a cup that had long since gone cold. Her shoulders were too still. Miss Marple entered, nodding politely to the server before making her way over. "May I sit?" Miss Pritchard glanced up, startled. "If you must." Miss Marple placed her gloves gently on the table. Ivy Green received her. "Violet," she said, with a note thanking her for silence. Miss Pritchard's lips parted, but no sound came. "You never thought to ask who else might know," Miss Marple continued. "Only who might be rewarded if they told." "You've no right. I have no intention of shaming you," Miss Marple said softly, only understanding. "You loved your brother in your own way. But you couldn't bear the idea of him giving away what you believed was yours, even if it meant he was making amends." Miss Pritchard's hand clenched around the spoon. "He was going to give the shop to that woman," she hissed. "That Elspeth. And for what? Some long-dead scandal. Some child that wasn't even claimed. He was trying to right a wrong," Miss Marple said. "One he couldn't face in life. I would have been left with nothing after all those years." "You had something far greater than inheritance," Miss Marple said, rising slowly. "You had his trust, and you buried it." She turned to leave, her steps quiet but firm behind her. The clink of porcelain was the only reply. Outside, the air had cooled. A breeze lifted the edge of her scarf, and in the distance, the bell from St. Mildred's rang once. Miss Marple paused and looked skyward. Soon, the flowers would bloom again, and with them, truth. The morning that followed was unseasonably still. A hush seemed to lie over Little Winthorpe, as though the entire village were holding its breath, waiting for something to settle like dust after a long-awaited confession. Miss Marple, ever composed, stood in her back garden pruning the wilting stalks of her zinnias, her gloved hands precise, methodical. The truth, she knew, was no longer buried. But it had not yet been spoken. Miss Pritchard's silence after their encounter in the tea room had been telling. No denial, no outrage, just a brittle, cornered stillness like a cracked vase that could no longer contain the water it was meant to hold. And while the police still lacked a confession, Miss Marple believed the soil of the matter had already begun to turn. Still, she needed one more thread pulled, something delicate and human, not legal, something that might nudge a conscience, or at the very least, reveal the shape of one. It came, as it often did, from a quiet voice on an ordinary lane. Mrs. Banfield, the vicar's wife, had been organising the annual church flower rota when she happened upon Miss Marple outside the post office. She wore her usual navy wool coat and carried a clipboard bristling with notes. "Oh, Miss Marple, you'll think I'm terribly forgetful, but would you mind terribly helping with the Easter arrangement in the nave next week? I meant to ask earlier, but with all that's happened." Miss Marple gave her a kind smile. "Of course, my dear. Though I suspect I'm more skilled with observation than oasis foam." Mrs. Banfield chuckled, then leaned in. "You know, it's strange. That sister of Mr. Pritchard came to the vestry yesterday. Said she wanted to donate a memorial flower for her brother. Lovely gesture, really, but odd, the way she asked for it." Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward her. "Odd in what way?" "Well, she said she wanted the arrangement to include forget-me-nots, lilies and foxglove, a rather peculiar combination. Said it was what he would have wanted. But I remember Godfrey once telling me he never used foxglove in his displays, too dangerous for pets." Miss Marple's breath caught for the briefest moment. "Foxglove," she repeated, "is quite poisonous, especially if steeped, even a little bit can cause cardiac arrest." Mrs. Banfield blinked. "Gracious, do you suppose—" Miss Marple only placed a gentle hand on the woman's arm. "It's simply a botanical curiosity." "Thank you, my dear." She walked slowly back through the village, each footstep echoing faintly in her ears. The final piece was not a document. It was not the envelope. It was not even the ledger. It was the teacup. Godfrey had not died in a rage or a scuffle. He had been prepared. Tea was part of his ritual. Whoever gave him that final cup, whoever stood beside him with foxglove close at hand, had intended for it to appear natural, quiet, as if his heart had simply given out. But hearts rarely surrender without cause. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid one last visit to Inspector Denham, whose desk now bore the weight of more evidence than his filing cabinets could hold. He looked up from a half-written report. With weary eyes. "You've come with another name, haven't you?" "I've come with a flower," she said. "Foxglove." He frowned. "Go on." She sat, hands folded neatly in her lap. Mrs. Pritchard asked for a church arrangement containing foxglove, a flower her brother never used, one he explicitly avoided. That tells me she was not simply reminiscing. She was recreating something, perhaps making peace with it. Denham leaned back, exhaling. "That aligns with the toxicology results. They were inconclusive, but there were traces of something consistent with digitalism. At the time, we didn't have enough context. You do now," she said quietly. "But motive?" he asked. "She wasn't poor. Her brother provided for her for years. She feared the loss of control." Miss Marple replied. Godfrey's new will left her with nothing but a memory she had spent decades repressing, and then she found out he was going to share it openly, not just in writing, but through flowers, through a shot passed on in her absence, through an act of public contrition. Denham was silent for a long time. "I can question her again," he said finally. "We've no confession, but her inconsistencies are piling up." "She'll not confess in your office," Miss Marple said gently, "but she may do so elsewhere," and so it was arranged. That evening, under a sky turning to lavender, Miss Marple invited Miss Pritchard to tea. It was not an ambush. No stern faces, no detectives in hiding. Only china cups, seed cake, and silence broken only by the ticking of a brass clock on the mantel. Miss Pritchard stared at her slice of cake, untouched. "I suppose you've told them," she said without looking up. "I've told them what I know," Miss Marple said softly, But there are things only you can explain. A pause. I thought it would be quick, Miss Pritchard said at last. He always took that blend at 5. I added just a few drops. The tincture came from an old bottle in the garden shed. For her heart, once, he drank it without looking at me. Miss Marple didn't interrupt. I thought I'd feel relieved, but I felt nothing. Just the ache of everything he never gave me. The childhood I guarded, the home I kept, and then to hear him planning to give it all to a woman who only ever whispered his name in the dark. What did she ever do for him? He was trying to make amends, Miss Marple said gently, for a life unspoken, for a daughter he never claimed, for love that lived too long in shadow. Miss Pritchard's hand trembled slightly as she set her teacup down. You knew, I suspected, said Miss Marple. Rosalind bore the shape of his brow. And Godfrey never once sent a bouquet on his own birthday, only hers. Silence settled again, and then, almost imperceptibly, the first tear fell. He wrote her name in that ledger. Miss Pritchard whispered, and he called her my child. I saw it. I tore out the page and burned it. She nodded. I couldn't let it exist. They sat in quiet company for a long time, until the last light slipped behind the curtains. Miss Marple rose, collected the empty cups, and set them gently in the sink. Outside, the night air had cooled, and a faint breeze rustled the leaves in her garden in the morning. The constable would collect Miss Pritchard, and Inspector Denham would do his solemn duty. But tonight, Miss Marple let the silence settle like pollen. Some truths, once unearthed, never go back to sleep. Monday dawned pale and hushed, as if the village itself was still unsure whether to begin the new week at all. The streets of Little Winthorpe were quieter than usual, even for early spring. At the bakery, Mrs. Forsyth served warm buns with an unusually subdued smile, and at the post office, the usual chatter about parcels and pension letters drifted into silence as soon as the door closed behind a visitor. Everyone knew by now Miss Pritchard had been escorted from her cottage just after dawn, composed, her handbag neatly clasped in both hands as though heading to church. She had said little to the constables, but her words from the evening before had been quietly recorded, and her actions confirmed by the missing tincture, the teacup residue, and the burned ledger page found hidden inside a planter beneath her back steps. There would be a formal inquest. Of course, a barrister might argue diminished responsibility or stress, but in Little Winthorpe, the trial had already taken place in glances, murmurs, and in the trembling hand of Mrs. Banfield as she removed Miss Pritchard's name from the church flower rota that morning. Miss Marple, however, had no interest in public condemnation. She sat quietly at her window, the morning light spilling over her small writing desk, her fingers resting on the edge of her garden diary. The entry for this day was already written. Violets returned, ivy trimmed, lilies for remembrance. There was one last matter still unsettled. After luncheon, she made her way down the lane once more, past the green where children no longer played with quite as much noise, past the milliners, where Miss Violet Crane had paused mid-display to glance uneasily at the church tower, and, finally, to the modest cottage at Fern Hollow. Mrs. Elspeth Lorne answered on the second knock. "Miss Marple," she said, a little warily, "I'm surprised to see you." "I had a thought," Miss Marple said gently, a final one. She was ushered into the conservatory once again. The ferns had grown taller in the past few days, curling elegantly across the glass like green lacework. The light here was filtered and soft, like the memories that lived in it. "I believe," Miss Marple began, "that you and Godfrey once made a promise." Elspeth blinked. What sort of promise? A promise to protect Evelyn, her memory, her daughter. "I believe Godfrey entrusted you with something, or someone." The older woman was silent for a long moment. Then, with great care, she reached into the side drawer of the cabinet beside her and removed a small photograph frame. She passed it across the table. The image was old sepia-toned and faded but clear enough, a girl of perhaps 10, with dark hair in ribbons and eyes too wise for her age. Stood beside a small basket of flowers, behind her, arms resting protectively. On her shoulders stood Elspeth herself. Rosalind, Elspeth said softly, she lived with me from the time she was 5. I never adopted her formally, but I raised her. Miss Marple looked down at the image with reverence. Did she know? Not until the end. I told her when she was ill. When she began asking questions about where she came from, I told her Godfrey was her father. Did she forgive him? She never hated him. Only the absence of him, Miss Marple placed the frame gently on the table. Then he was right to try and leave the shop to you. Not out of guilt alone, but in memory of her. Elspeth's eyes filled with tears. I never wanted the building. I only wanted him to say her name once, just once. In the daylight, Miss Marple reached across the table and touched her hand. Now the village will remember it, in full bloom. 2 days later, the shop reopened. It did not reopen as Violet and Ivy, though the name still lingered faintly above the doorway like the last scent of a flower past its season. The new hand-painted sign simply read Rosalind's inside. The layout remained unchanged: the wooden counters, the wall of vases, the back room where cool air kept the blooms fresh. But now the flowers spoke more openly. There were no hidden messages in the ledgers. The new proprietor, a woman named Margaret who had once trained under Godfrey in Milchester, kept the books as transparently as the shop's windows. Elspeth helped arrange displays. Lionel Brent returned as delivery boy, though he no longer whistled quite as loudly. And on the first day of spring, Ivy Green brought in a basket of violets, each one freshly clipped from her own garden. Miss Marple visited just once. She stood quietly near the window display, where a wreath of forget-me-nots had been fashioned into a ring and placed beside a single white rose and a sprig of heather. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Margaret asked kindly. "No, thank you," Miss Marple said with a small smile. "I just wanted to see how the flowers speak when no one is afraid to hear them." Outside, the church bells tolled once again, not in mourning, but in rhythm. Life in Little Winthorpe resumed its gentle course, though perhaps just a little slower, a little wiser. In her cottage garden, Miss Marple returned to her tulips and her rose beds, the edges trimmed, the earth turned with the patience of someone who knew the value of time and trust. The case was closed, but some stories, like bulbs hidden beneath the frost, would bloom again quietly, beautifully, and when the moment was just right.